He wasn't the man you saw on the front pages. He didn't command armies, he didn't order executions, and he rarely even stepped into the spotlight. Yet without him, Pablo Escobar's empire would have collapsed before it began. His name was Gustavo Gaviria, the quiet cousin who became the true architect of the Medellín Cartel's fortune, the man who turned blood money into a global business. While Escobar fueled chaos in the streets, Gustavo fueled the empire's growth behind closed doors. He handled billions in cash, moved it through hidden channels, and created a financial network so complex that even international agencies couldn't trace it. They called Escobar the king of cocaine, but Gustavo was the one who built the kingdom. Every smuggled kilo, every bribe, every offshore account, all passed through his meticulous calculations. He didn't believe in violence. He believed in numbers, systems, and logic. He was the mind that turned crime into a multinational operation. Yet, as the empire grew, so did the danger. Law enforcement began to close in, and the man who stayed invisible for years finally became a target. This is the untold story of how one man, calm, brilliant, and ruthless in business, engineered the rise of one of the most powerful criminal organizations in history. The story of the hidden brain behind Pablo Escobar's empire, Gustavo Gaviria. Gustavo Gaviria was never the loud one in the room. He didn't command attention with guns or power. He earned it with silence, calculation, and precision. Long before the Medellín Cartel became a billion-dollar empire, Gustavo was simply a young man obsessed with organization. Born in Medellín in 1946, he grew up in a middle-class Colombian family that valued education and hard work. He was bright, methodical, and gifted with numbers. While his cousin Pablo Escobar spent his youth chasing fast money and dreaming of becoming the king of Medellín, Gustavo was studying finance and business. He wasn't interested in chaos. He was fascinated by systems, how small movements of money could create massive results. When Pablo started making a name for himself smuggling appliances and contraband cigarettes, Gustavo didn't immediately join him. But he watched closely, understanding how the underground economy worked. He saw opportunity, and he saw risk. Pablo had the charisma and ambition to take control of the streets, but Gustavo realized that without structure, it would all fall apart. The drug trade, he believed, needed a brain, not just muscle. So when Escobar entered the cocaine business in the mid-1970s, Gustavo offered to manage the financial side. That single decision would change both of their lives and the course of history. At first, his role seemed small. He helped organize payments, kept ledgers, and tracked expenses for the early smuggling operations. But as shipments multiplied, Gustavo's systems became essential. He treated the cartel like a company. Every trafficker was given a specific responsibility, every pilot had a schedule, and every payment was documented. Not on paper that could be found, but in coded language only he understood. To the untrained eye, it was chaos. To Gustavo, it was balance. He built a model of control that no other criminal organization had achieved. While Escobar built his image as a ruthless and feared leader, Gustavo stayed invisible, a ghost within the empire. He avoided violence whenever possible, believing that intelligence could protect them better than weapons. Escobar trusted him completely. In fact, Gustavo was one of the very few people Pablo would listen to when tempers flared. Their relationship worked because they were opposites. Escobar was impulsive and emotional. Gustavo was rational and calm. Together, they created a partnership that blended brutality with brilliance. As the business expanded, Gustavo introduced new strategies that turned the Medellín Cartel into an economic powerhouse. He hired professional accountants and lawyers, legitimate minds who could launder money through international banks. He established fake companies in Panama and the Cayman Islands, turning drug profits into investments that looked legal on paper. He even started using American financial institutions to move cash across borders, hiding millions behind layers of transactions that authorities couldn't trace. For every kilo of cocaine Escobar sold, Gustavo ensured that the money was not only received, but multiplied. He also understood the importance of logistics. While others focused on smuggling routes and bribing officials, Gustavo focused on timing, fuel costs, plane maintenance, and return efficiency. Nothing escaped his attention. He would spend nights analyzing flight data and delivery schedules to find small adjustments that saved thousands of dollars per trip. It was this attention to detail that made him indispensable. Under his watch, the cartel's profits exploded. Within just a few years, the Medellín Cartel controlled nearly 80% of the world's cocaine trade. Yet even as billions flowed in, Gustavo never flaunted his wealth. Unlike Escobar, he avoided luxury mansions or public displays of power. He lived modestly, wore simple clothes, and surrounded himself with books instead of bodyguards. He didn't want to be the face of the cartel. He wanted to be its mind, silent, strategic, and untouchable. By the late 1970s, every major financial decision passed through him. He had become the architect of an empire, the invisible force holding everything together. Escobar might have been the king, but Gustavo was the man who built the throne. Without him, there would be no cartel, no billion-dollar network, no global dominance. In those early years, the balance between Escobar's aggression and Gustavo's intelligence seemed perfect. One ruled through fear, the other through numbers. Together, they transformed the Medellín Cartel into one of the most powerful criminal organizations the world had ever seen. And as long as Gustavo's mind was running the operation, nothing seemed impossible. By the early 1980s, the Medellín Cartel had evolved from a local smuggling operation into a multinational empire, and at the heart of its financial machinery was Gustavo Gaviria. While Pablo Escobar's name became synonymous with cocaine, terror, and dominance, Gustavo became the silent architect behind the flow of billions. His role was no longer just managing ledgers. He had built an intricate financial network that connected South America, Central America, and the United States, a system so sophisticated that even seasoned bankers couldn't untangle it. Gustavo understood that cocaine was not just a product, it was an economy. To keep that economy stable, he had to think bigger than Colombia. He developed offshore systems that funneled cartel money through a web of fake companies and legitimate investments. He used Panama, the Cayman Islands, and Switzerland as safe havens for laundering operations. Every dollar that entered the cartel's vaults was filtered, cleaned, and reinvested into businesses that appeared completely legal. Under Gustavo's direction, the cartel began buying banks, shipping companies, real estate, and even small factories, all used as covers for money laundering. But his true genius wasn't just in hiding money, it was in making it grow. Gustavo reinvested millions into legitimate markets, from construction and agriculture to currency exchange businesses. He studied global economic trends and used that knowledge to keep the cartel liquid even when governments cracked down on cash movements. To outsiders, he looked like a successful entrepreneur, calm and collected. In reality, he was orchestrating one of the largest illegal financial operations in history. Gustavo also created an internal accounting system so advanced it rivaled legitimate corporations. He trained a team of loyal accountants who worked in secret, using coded systems to track every transaction. Each route had its own financial chain: pilots, distributors, suppliers, and enforcers, all paid with precision. He even developed methods to handle physical cash flow. Since billions of dollars came in through cocaine sales in the US, moving and storing that money was a massive problem. Gustavo came up with solutions no one else dared to try. He arranged fleets of trucks, private planes, and warehouses solely to transport and stash cash. At one point, the cartel was earning an estimated $420 million a week, far too much to launder traditionally. So Gustavo developed creative methods, storing cash in walls, burying it in farmlands, even sealing it inside barrels. He maintained a balance between hiding and investing, ensuring that enough cash was available to pay bribes, buy loyalty, and fund operations, while the rest was silently funneled through banks disguised as legitimate trade. Despite the massive scale of his operations, Gustavo remained invisible. He didn't attend public meetings or show off wealth. His power came from knowledge, knowing exactly how much money was made, where it went, and who handled it. Even Escobar relied entirely on him to understand the true financial health of the cartel. Without Gustavo's calculations, Escobar's empire would have collapsed under its own weight. But Gustavo wasn't just handling numbers, he was managing people. He understood that loyalty was the backbone of secrecy. He paid his workers well, treated them with respect, and built a culture of fear and admiration around precision. A single mistake could lead to exposure, and Gustavo made it clear that accuracy was life or death. Every accountant knew their code, their limits, and the price of betrayal. His ability to predict financial risk made him invaluable. When the Colombian government began tightening its financial regulations under U.S. pressure, Gustavo anticipated it months in advance. He moved millions out of vulnerable accounts and relocated assets before they could be frozen. This foresight saved the cartel hundreds of millions and reinforced his status as the true genius behind its stability. Under Gustavo's direction, the Medellín Cartel became more than a criminal empire. It became an economic powerhouse that rivaled legitimate corporations. It funded communities, built infrastructure, and even infiltrated politics. Every dollar circulating in Medellín had Gustavo's fingerprints on it. Yet, as the money flowed faster and larger than ever before, it also began to draw attention from global agencies. The DEA, the CIA, and financial watchdogs across multiple countries. Gustavo knew the system he built was strong, but not indestructible. For now, though, it was perfect. A hidden empire within an empire, and he was the only one who truly understood how deep its roots went. By the mid-1980s, Pablo Escobar's war against the Colombian state was reaching its blood-soaked peak. Car bombs exploded in Bogotá, judges were assassinated, and politicians lived in constant fear. The streets burned, but through all the chaos, Gustavo Gaviria remained calm, the quiet mind that refused to be consumed by the madness. While Escobar declared war on governments, Gustavo declared war on inefficiency. His job was to keep the empire alive, no matter how much blood was spilled outside. He operated from secure offices and safe houses, surrounded not by bodyguards, but by accountants, managers, and communication experts. The sound of gunfire never distracted him. His world was made of numbers, coded reports, and phone calls from secret lines. As the violence grew, Gustavo doubled down on control. He knew that wars drained money, and the Medellín cartel's survival depended not on bullets, but on balance sheets. Every time Escobar launched a new offensive, a bombing, a political assassination, or a military bribe, Gustavo had to find the funds to keep it running smoothly. But while Escobar believed in fear, Gustavo believed in strategy. He constantly warned his cousin that too much violence would destroy the stability they had built. "Empires," he once said, "don't fall from weakness. They fall from arrogance." Escobar rarely listened. He wanted dominance. Gustavo wanted survival. That quiet tension between them grew sharper with every explosion that rocked Colombia. Behind the scenes, Gustavo continued to protect what was left of the business. He developed contingency plans in case of raids and asset seizures. He moved key operations into Venezuela and Panama, hiding resources where Colombian authorities couldn't reach them. He even began shifting funds into European accounts, sensing that South America was becoming too unstable. His moves were quiet but critical, each one designed to ensure that if Escobar's war failed, the money would survive. At the same time, Gustavo maintained a delicate network of negotiations with other cartels and criminal groups. He understood diplomacy in a world built on greed and violence. When rival organizations began fighting over routes, Gustavo often stepped in as a negotiator, using logic and financial incentive to prevent full-blown war. Many traffickers respected him more than they feared Escobar. To them, Gustavo was not a criminal. He was a businessman who understood both risk and reward. His sense of order even extended to how the cartel dealt with corruption. Instead of random bribes, Gustavo created an organized system of payments to politicians, military officers, and police commanders. Every transaction was logged, not by name, but by code, ensuring that loyalty could be tracked and verified. He treated bribery as a form of investment, calculating returns not in percentages, but in protection and silence. Even in the darkest moments of Escobar's war, Gustavo found ways to innovate. He experimented with new money laundering fronts, investing in nightclubs, export companies, and even film businesses to disguise cartel income. He used art galleries to move millions through fake sales and began acquiring assets in Miami and Spain through trusted intermediaries. He was always 10 steps ahead of investigators, predicting their next move before they even realized what they were looking for. But for all his intelligence, Gustavo couldn't ignore the growing pressure from the United States. The DEA was tightening its grip, and extradition treaties made Colombia increasingly dangerous. U.S. agents began tracing suspicious bank accounts, uncovering networks of shell companies connected to the cartel. Each discovery pushed Gustavo to adapt faster. He destroyed records, moved money into cash reserves, and cut ties with exposed partners. Still, he never showed panic. His calm under fire became legendary within the organization. Even as Escobar grew paranoid and erratic, Gustavo stayed focused. He often acted as a mediator between Escobar and the other members of the cartel, preventing internal collapse. Without him, the Medellín Cartel might have torn itself apart from within long before the government could destroy it. To outsiders, he was invisible. No photos in newspapers, no public enemies list, no bounty on his head for years. But those who knew him understood his power. Gustavo was the equilibrium, the brain that stabilized chaos. And though he never picked up a gun, he was the one holding the empire together while everything around him burned. Yet deep inside, he began to realize that stability couldn't last forever. The empire he built was too big, too exposed, and too dependent on one man's obsession with power. The storm was coming, and even the calmest mind could not escape it forever. By the early 1990s, the Medellín Cartel was no longer the unstoppable empire it once was. The walls were closing in, from every direction. The Colombian government, pressured by the United States, had declared total war on Escobar and his network. Safe houses were raided, airstrips destroyed, and key lieutenants either captured or killed. The once flawless system Gustavo Gaviria had built was beginning to crumble under the weight of chaos and betrayal. For the first time in his life, the calm, calculating genius faced a storm he couldn't completely control. Gustavo had always been the realist. He could see what Escobar refused to admit, that the empire was bleeding out. The DEA had infiltrated money channels in Panama, the banks were closing their doors, and even loyal politicians were turning their backs on the cartel. Yet Escobar refused to slow down. He wanted revenge for every friend killed, every ally betrayed. He waged war on the government with bombs and bullets, but Gustavo knew that every explosion was another nail in their financial coffin. Behind the scenes, Gustavo fought to save what he could. He began transferring remaining funds into offshore accounts, spreading money across multiple continents in smaller, untraceable amounts. He converted assets into gold, art, and real estate, anything that could hold value, even if the banks froze their accounts. He sent trusted men abroad to hide money in Switzerland, Spain, and Venezuela. But no matter how hard he worked, the cracks were widening. U.S. agents were intercepting communications, freezing assets, and closing the financial routes that had once made the cartel untouchable. Inside the organization, paranoia spread like wildfire. Informants appeared in every corner. People Gustavo once trusted disappeared overnight. Some captured, others executed. Every meeting became a risk. Every phone call could be tapped. Gustavo's network of accountants and couriers was shrinking fast. Some had fled, others had been arrested. The empire that once ran like a perfectly tuned machine was now breaking down piece by piece. And yet, in the middle of all this, Gustavo remained composed. He still believed there was a way to retreat strategically, to rebuild quietly outside Colombia. He advised Escobar to lay low, to move operations elsewhere, even to negotiate a deal with the government to avoid total destruction. But Pablo's pride wouldn't allow it. He couldn't imagine surrender, not to the state, not to the DEA, not to anyone. "We don't negotiate with traitors," Escobar reportedly said. "We destroy them." Gustavo knew then that the man he once called cousin was becoming his own worst enemy. As the pressure mounted, Gustavo became the voice of reason inside an empire driven by madness. He was tired, not of money, but of chaos. He wanted to protect his family, his legacy, and what remained of their vast fortune. But with Escobar's obsession blinding every decision, Gustavo realized that logic no longer ruled the Medellín Cartel. Fear did. The government's new elite police units, trained and funded by the U.S., began targeting Gustavo directly. They knew he was the brain, the one who could dismantle or rebuild the cartel's money systems. Without him, Escobar's financial network would collapse completely. Surveillance teams tracked every move he made, every phone signal he used. His houses were raided one after another, forcing him to constantly relocate. For the first time, Gustavo felt the enemy's breath on his neck. Despite the danger, he continued sending coded messages to loyal contacts abroad, trying to salvage whatever could be saved. His last efforts were not about expansion. They were about preservation. He was no longer building an empire. He was trying to keep the ashes intact. But deep inside, he knew the inevitable truth. The Medellín Cartel was dying, and with it, everything he had worked for. In those final months, Gustavo's life became a quiet race against time. The genius who had once managed billions now lived like a fugitive, moving between safe houses, sleeping only a few hours, never staying in one place for long. The empire he built through intelligence was collapsing under violence, pride, and betrayal. And, though he kept working until the very end, Gustavo knew that numbers could no longer save them. The man who built the foundation of Pablo Escobar's empire was now standing on its ruins, watching it fall piece by piece, and there was nothing left to calculate. On August 11th, 1990, the inevitable finally caught up to Gustavo Gaviria. For over a decade, he had been the hidden heartbeat of the Medellín Cartel, the quiet genius who built its empire, kept its books clean, and turned cocaine into an international economy. But by that year, the empire had begun to rot from within. Betrayals, informants, and Escobar's unending war with the government had pushed everything to collapse. Gustavo, once untouchable, was now hunted, not just by the Colombian authorities, but by the DEA, military intelligence, and even rival cartels who wanted to dismantle Escobar's legacy piece by piece. That morning in Medellín, Gustavo was in one of his safe houses, still working on what he did best: numbers. Even in the final days, he refused to panic. He was mapping out remaining assets, trying to find ways to save what was left of their fortune. But the calm that had protected him for years was finally useless. Colombian police, tipped off by intelligence reports, surrounded the area. What happened next was quick and brutal. The official version said there was a gunfight. Gustavo was shot and killed when he resisted arrest. But those who knew him doubted it. Gustavo was not a man who fought. He was a man who calculated. Many believed he was executed on the spot, a message to Escobar that his world was falling apart. When news of Gustavo's death reached Pablo Escobar, witnesses say he broke down completely. The man who never showed emotion, who could order hundreds of killings without blinking, reportedly cried for hours. Gustavo wasn't just his cousin. He was his balance, his brain, his moral restraint. With Gustavo gone, Escobar lost the only person who ever made him think rationally. From that moment forward, the Medellín Cartel's collapse accelerated. The financial systems Gustavo had built started disintegrating within weeks. The money stopped flowing, the accounts froze, and corruption networks began to unravel. Without his guidance, Escobar's empire quickly turned from a global business into a desperate war machine. Gustavo's death marked the true beginning of the end. Even Escobar's enemies admitted it. Killing Gustavo was more effective than destroying a dozen cocaine labs. His death wasn't just the loss of a man, it was the death of intelligence within the cartel. The balance between chaos and order was gone, leaving only chaos. Escobar responded the only way he knew how: with rage. He unleashed a new wave of terror across Colombia, targeting politicians, police, and anyone he believed responsible. But no matter how many enemies he killed, he couldn't rebuild what Gustavo had created. Money without control was worthless. Power without structure was doomed. In Medellín, Gustavo's funeral was quiet. There were no grand speeches, no public tributes. Only a small circle of family and a few trusted associates attended. For years, people would speak of him in whispers. The man who could have been a banker, an economist, or a CEO, but instead became the invisible hand behind one of history's most dangerous empires. Unlike Escobar, he never sought fame, and after death, he received none. His legacy was buried under the chaos of the war he had tried so hard to contain. Yet, even decades later, investigators studying the Medellín Cartel still marvel at the sophistication of his work. Gustavo's systems were so advanced that traces of his methods could still be found in modern organized crime networks. He had redefined the economics of illegal trade, proving that brains could be far more powerful than brutality. In many ways, he was the cartel's greatest weapon and its greatest loss. When the dust finally settled, the empire Gustavo helped build no longer existed. Escobar was on the run, his fortune shrinking, his allies dead or imprisoned. The empire of blood and money had come to an end, and it had started with the death of the one man who never wanted to be king. The man who preferred calculators over guns, silence over fame, and logic over violence. Gustavo Gaviria, the hidden brain behind Pablo Escobar's empire, died as he lived, quietly, intelligently, and in the shadows. His story remains a haunting reminder that even the most powerful empires are built not just on violence or ambition, but on the minds that make them possible, and the silence that holds them together until it's broken forever.